In 1901, a sponge diver off a tiny Greek island reached into the wreck of a Roman-era cargo ship and pulled up a corroded lump of bronze the size of a shoebox. It sat ignored in a museum drawer for 50 years. When scientists finally X-rayed it, they found something that should not have existed in 200 BC. More than 30 precisely cut gears, machined to tolerances that wouldn't reappear in human hands for 1,400 years. Inscriptions invisible to the naked eye. A working mechanical model of the cosmos. This was the Antikythera mechanism. And when modern engineers finally understood what they were holding, they didn't just update the textbooks. They threw them out entirely. To understand why the Antikythera mechanism matters, you first need to stand inside it, at least in your imagination. Picture a small Greek island in the Aegean Sea, halfway between Crete and the southern tip of the Peloponnese. Sheer cliffs drop straight into deep blue water. Now picture a Roman-era cargo ship, somewhere around 60 BC, loaded with bronze statues and amphorae of wine, sailing northwest from Rhodes toward Italy. A storm catches it against the cliffs. The ship goes down in roughly 45 meters of water and stays there for nearly 2,000 years. When sponge divers pulled fragments of its cargo to the surface in 1901, almost everything fit neatly into the world archaeologists already understood. Then they pulled up something else, a corroded lump of bronze and wood roughly the size of a modern shoebox, fused into a single mass by 2 millennia of seawater. It went into a drawer at the National Archaeological Museum of Athens and sat there for half a century. When the lump finally cracked open, the first thing anyone could see were gears. Not one or two, but a dense interlocking cluster of them, machined into a single bronze plate, each tooth cut into a precise triangular profile. Each gear sized to mesh exactly with the next. Inscriptions in ancient Greek covered every flat surface, some letters smaller than 2 millimeters tall. Now consider the timeline, because this is where things get genuinely difficult to absorb. The mechanical clock, humanity's first sophisticated geared instrument, was invented in medieval Europe around 1300 AD. The kind of precision gear cutting required to build a reliable astronomical computer didn't fully mature until the 1700s. The Antikythera mechanism predates all of this by 1,400 years. Its construction sits somewhere around 200 to 150 BC. By the time medieval craftsmen were building their first crude tower clocks, this object had already been on the seafloor for over 1,000 years, machined to tolerances those craftsmen could not have matched on their best day. At the time those bronze gears were being cut, none of the things we associate with precision machining existed. No machine lathes, no powered milling tools, no hardened steel cutters, no micrometers, no standardized measurement systems. The people responsible for the Antikythera mechanism weren't supposed to be capable of building the Antikythera mechanism. For half a century after its discovery, the lump of bronze sat in storage almost entirely ignored. Museum staff cataloged it, photographed it, and moved on. The fragments were too corroded to study by eye, too fragile to clean aggressively, and too strange to fit into any existing category of ancient artifact. Whatever it was, it would have to wait. It waited until Derek J. de Sola Price arrived. Price was a British physicist turned historian of science, working at Yale by the 1950s, with an unusual willingness to take seriously objects that other scholars dismissed as anomalies. In 1951, he began studying the Antikythera fragments. By 1959, he had published his first paper arguing that the device was a working astronomical computer. The academic reception was polite skepticism, which is the most damning response a serious claim can receive. He needed to see inside the corrosion. In 1971, working with Greek radiographer Charalambos Karakalos, Price arranged the first systematic X-ray and gamma-ray imaging of the fragments. The results were extraordinary. Beneath the surface crust, the radiographs revealed a dense network of interlocking gears, far more than anyone had previously suspected, arranged in configurations that suggested deliberate astronomical calculation. Price counted at least 30 gears. He identified differential gear arrangements. He traced ratios that corresponded to the lunar cycle. In 1974, he published his definitive paper, Gears from the Greeks, and made a claim that sent quiet shockwaves through the history of science. His most provocative conclusion was also his most enduring. The mechanism, he argued, was not a one-off curiosity or a religious votive object. It was a sophisticated working computer, mathematically modeling the heavens with mechanical gear ratios, built within a craft tradition that must have included other devices like it. Devices that had simply not survived. The implication was clear. Greek engineering of the 2nd century BC was operating at a level of mechanical sophistication that mainstream history had never acknowledged, and an entire lost tradition of precision instrument making had to have existed to produce it. That idea sent shockwaves through the field. Most scholars resisted it for years. Price died in 1983, before the next generation of imaging technology could prove him right. And the story was only just beginning. When something this old and this impressive turns up in the engineering record, imagination tends to arrive before science does. And imagination, it turns out, is remarkably creative when confronted with a 2,000-year-old computer. The theories began almost as soon as the mechanism became publicly known. For some, the sheer sophistication of the device was proof enough that ordinary ancient craftsmen couldn't have been responsible. Something else must have been involved. And from that single assumption, an entire ecosystem of alternative explanations bloomed. There were those who linked the mechanism to Atlantis, arguing it was salvaged technology from a vanished pre-flood civilization that had mastered precision engineering long before the Greeks. Others connected it to ancient astronaut theories, suggesting the gear ratios were too refined for human hands and must have been gifted by visitors from elsewhere. Erich von Däniken's framework was applied to it almost reflexively. Graham Hancock has cited it as evidence for his lost advanced civilization hypothesis, arguing that an object this sophisticated proves a forgotten technological tradition was destroyed in the catastrophe he believes wiped the prehistoric world clean. One particularly creative reading proposed that the mechanism was a fragment of a much larger device, possibly a working orrery the size of a room, designed by a civilization that had achieved industrial-scale machining and then mysteriously vanished. This requires the Greeks to have inherited working tooling from a culture for which there is no archaeological evidence whatsoever, which is, to put it generously, an extraordinary stretch. What all of these theories share beneath their surface differences is a single unspoken assumption: that the engineers of Hellenistic Greece, the actual human beings who designed the bronze water organs of Ctesibius and the steam-driven novelties of Hero of Alexandria, were simply not capable of building this themselves. That assumption has deep roots in 19th century thinking about progress, the idea that pre-industrial meant pre-sophisticated, that anyone without electricity and steel was essentially closer to a child than to us. It is a deeply condescending view, and it is wrong. Every fringe theory about the Antikythera mechanism ultimately rests on this same crumbling foundation. And when modern imaging finally cracked the device open, it revealed something the conspiracy theories had never considered. Before the headline reveal, the mechanism's own physical evidence had to do its work. And once researchers learned how to look at it properly, the evidence was overwhelming. Start with the gears themselves. The The surviving fragments contain at least 30 precisely cut bronze gears, and metallurgical analysis shows the bronze was a specific tin-copper alloy chosen deliberately for its machinability and dimensional stability. Each gear tooth is cut to a triangular profile with an apex angle averaging around 60 degrees. Tooth spacing across the largest gear varies by less than half a millimeter across its full circumference. That is fractional millimeter precision, achieved by hand in 200 BC. Then consider the tool marks. Microscopic examination of the gear surfaces reveals fine concentric scoring consistent with a manually rotated cutting tool, almost certainly a hardened bronze or iron file guided against a slowly turned blank. The cuts are remarkably uniform, suggesting the use of a dividing plate or template to space each tooth identically. This is not improvisation. This is a workshop with established procedures. The plate work tells the same story. The bronze housing is hammered and worked to consistent thickness, with mounting holes drilled to tolerances that allow the gear shafts to rotate freely without wobble. Mike Edmonds, the Cardiff University astrophysicist who led much of the modern reanalysis, has stated publicly that the manufacturing quality compares favorably to 18th century European clockwork. The inscriptions add another layer. Roughly 3,400 Greek characters have now been recovered from the fragments, some letters less than 1.2 millimeters tall, engraved with a precision that required either extraordinary eyesight or magnification. We have no evidence the Greeks possessed. The text functions as a user manual, naming the planets, describing the dials, explaining the cycles being modeled. The associated finds matter too. The shipwreck contained luxury cargo bound for wealthy Roman buyers. Bronze statues, fine glassware, marble. The mechanism was not a curiosity. It was a high-value commissioned instrument moving through a known commercial network. The picture that emerges is not of a lucky one-off accident. It is of a community of practiced specialists working systematically with deep accumulated knowledge, embedded in a craft tradition sophisticated enough to produce instruments like this on demand. For most of the mechanism's modern history, the device kept its secrets. The corrosion was too thick, the fragments too fragile, and the internal geometry too dense for conventional imaging to resolve. Then, in the early 2000s, micro-focus computed tomography changed that completely. In 2005, the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, a collaboration between Cardiff University, the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, and the imaging company X-Tech Systems, brought an 8-ton custom CT scanner to Athens. The machine, called the Blade Runner, was designed for inspecting jet turbine blades. It could resolve internal structures at a resolution of roughly 50 micrometers, fine enough to read individual letters of Greek text buried inside 2 millennia of corrosion. What it found rewrote everything. The scans revealed the full gear train in 3 dimensions. The mechanism modeled the synodic month, the Metonic 19-year calendar cycle, the Saros eclipse cycle of roughly 18 years, and the 4-year cycle of the Pan-Hellenic Games, including the Olympics. A pin and slot mechanism on one of the gears reproduced the irregular speed of the Moon's orbit around Earth. This is the variation Johannes Kepler would mathematically describe in 1609 AD as the consequence of an elliptical orbit. The Antikythera mechanism was reproducing the effect mechanically, with bronze gears 1,700 years earlier. In 2021, a team at University College London, led by Tony Freeth, published a complete 3D reconstruction of the device's front face. The model showed concentric rings tracking the Sun, the Moon, and all 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, each driven by its own gear train calibrated to its observed period. The CT data also exposed inscriptions that had been invisible for 2,000 years, including text that explicitly identified the device as a teaching instrument and referenced the cosmic models of specific Hellenistic astronomers by name. This matters enormously. The inscriptions show no hidden author from outside the Greek tradition, no anomalous knowledge, no influx of impossible technology. The device names its own intellectual heritage, and that heritage is entirely Hellenistic Greek. The Antikythera mechanism is not an anomaly. It is the only surviving example of a tradition that produced many such instruments. The technology behind the Antikythera mechanism did not stay buried with it. That is perhaps the most quietly astonishing thing the modern analysis revealed. The geared calculation tradition that produced this device traveled. Hellenistic mechanical knowledge moved eastward through the trade routes of Alexandria and the eastern Mediterranean, surviving in fragmentary form through the late Roman period and into the Islamic Golden Age. By the 9th century, Baghdad astronomers were building geared astrolabes that performed simplified versions of the same calculations the Antikythera mechanism had performed 1,000 years earlier. The Persian polymath al-Biruni described a geared lunar calendar device around 1000 AD, whose internal logic descends recognizably from the Greek tradition. Arabic engineering manuals preserved the underlying mathematics through centuries when European workshops had forgotten it entirely. When the knowledge eventually returned to Europe, it returned through Spain and Sicily, carried by the same translation movements that brought back Aristotle and Ptolemy. The first medieval European geared clocks of the 13th century were not independent inventions. They were the resurfacing of a tradition that had been dormant in the Latin West for over a millennium. Richard of Wallingford's astronomical clock at St. Albans Abbey in the 1320s, with its complex differential gearing for the moon's irregular motion, descends in a clear intellectual line from the same problem the Antikythera engineers had already solved in 200 BC. And here is where the distance of 2,000 years collapses into something far more immediate. The gear ratios in your car's transmission, the differential that lets your wheels turn at different speeds when you take a corner, the mechanical watch on someone's wrist, the precision indexing on every CNC machine in every modern factory, all of it descends from the same fundamental insight. That rotational motion can be divided, multiplied, and translated through meshed teeth to model any mathematical relationship you can describe. The engineers who designed the Antikythera mechanism were not building a curiosity. They were laying the foundation of every precision machine that came after. Derek de Sola Price did not live to see the CT scans confirm his thesis in full. He had been right about the most important thing. He just didn't live quite long enough to watch the imaging prove it. Let's put the lost civilization argument to rest properly because it deserves more than a dismissive wave. It deserves to be dismantled with the actual evidence of what Hellenistic engineers were genuinely capable of. And that evidence is frankly stunning. Start with Ctesibius of Alexandria, working around 270 BC. He built water organs driven by precisely calibrated air pressure, force pumps with leather valves capable of moving water against gravity, and the first reliable water clocks accurate enough to regulate Athenian court proceedings. His workshop was producing precision pneumatics and hydraulics over a century before the Antikythera mechanism was built. Then consider Archimedes of Syracuse. Beyond the mathematics he is remembered for, he built a planetarium described in detail by Cicero, a working geared model of the heavens that displayed the motions of the sun, moon, and planets. Cicero saw it personally in the 1st century BC and wrote that it accurately reproduced eclipses. That is a direct ancestor of the Antikythera mechanism, described in surviving Roman text, built by the most famous engineer of the ancient world. Then there is Hero of Alexandria, working in the 1st century AD. He built programmable automata driven by falling weights and rotating drums, a working steam engine called the Eolipile, vending machines for holy water in temples, and self-opening temple doors triggered by altar fires. His surviving manuals describe gear trains, screw cutting, and precision metalwork in operational detail. The Tower of the Winds in Athens, built around 50 BC, contained a sophisticated water clock with mechanical indicators of the sun's position and the seasons. Roman surveyors used the dioptra, a geared sighting instrument capable of measuring angles to a fraction of a degree across kilometers of terrain. Aqueduct gradients across the empire were maintained accurate to centimeters across distances exceeding 100 kilometers. Replication experiments confirm what the surviving objects already imply. Modern machinists have reproduced the Antikythera gear train using only tools and techniques available in 200 BC. It is achievable, slow, demanding, requiring patience and accumulated craft knowledge, but entirely achievable. There was no miracle of engineering here. There was accumulated knowledge, generational craft transmission, and determined human effort. The same brain, the same cognitive capacity, the same imagination that exists in every person alive today. The Antikythera mechanism is often described as the world's first computer, but that framing, compelling as it is, undersells what this object actually represents. It is not just a device, it is a threshold, the moment preserved in bronze where something fundamental shifted in the human story. The point at which abstract mathematical models of the cosmos became physical, mechanical, turnable by hand. The CT scans didn't reveal gods or aliens or salvaged technology from a vanished super-civilization. They revealed people, specific, traceable, fully human engineers working in Hellenistic Greek workshops, drawing on a craft tradition that stretched back through Archimedes and Ctesibius into centuries of accumulated experimentation. The names of the astronomers whose models the device reproduces are inscribed on the device itself. The intellectual lineage is not hidden. It was sitting on the surface the whole time, waiting only for imaging technology to read it. What still cannot be answered is what else existed alongside it. The inscriptions identify the mechanism as a teaching instrument, which means it was not unique. Others were built. Others sat on the desks of wealthy Roman patrons, in the libraries of Alexandrian scholars, in the workshops of unnamed craftsmen across the Mediterranean. None of them survived. The Antikythera mechanism survived only because a ship carrying it sank into anoxic mud at exactly the right depth, where corrosion slowed and oxygen could not destroy the bronze. Every other example was melted down for scrap, lost in fires, or dissolved into the ground. If one object this advanced survived 2,000 years underwater entirely by accident, the obvious question is what existed that didn't? Whatever else that workshop tradition produced, it is gone. The mechanism is not the peak of ancient engineering, it is the only fragment of that peak that geography happened to preserve. With only one example recovered, the Antikythera mechanism is almost certainly not finished rewriting history. Whatever is still buried in shipwrecks across the Mediterranean, in unexcavated workshop floors, in museum drawers waiting for the next generation of imaging technology, it was put there by people who needed no outside hand to achieve something extraordinary. They looked at the sky and imagined a machine that could hold it. Then they built it.